Hello everyone, my name is Austin Losick, and tonight I will be presenting to you on the Republic of Singapore. So first and foremost, Singapore is actually pretty new to having its own independence. As you can see on the slide here, they actually declared their independence on August 9th of 1965. A little background on that, they were under British control for a good portion of their history up into World War II. And then in World War II, Japan actually attacked Singapore, and Britain relieved their control over Singapore to the Japanese. Shortly after the war ended, this was kind of the big catalyst for Singapore to move towards their own independence. They saw this as a sign of weakness from the British to just give up their country. As for the geography of Singapore, it is a group of islands, and it is in Malaysia or Maritime South Asia. As you can see on my screen here, that's the main island of Singapore and some outlined areas of some of the different satellite islands. As for the area, it's 279.6 square miles, and it's actually a pretty fairly flat island. The highest point is only roughly 600 feet, so they don't have the tallest points there. Now for the population size, there's actually 5.7 million people as of 2019, and they're the third most populated densely country in the world, with a population density of 21,646 people for every square mile. So you take one square mile, and that's how many people can roughly fit in it with how dense it is. Now for the important fact, and we'll circle back to this at the end as well. At the beginning of their independence, they had a similar GDP of Mexico and Africa. They had a lot of unemployment and poverty within their country, and the Singapore government decided that they wanted to embrace globalization. They modeled themselves after a couple of Saudi countries that had embraced globalization and were able to have a pretty good economy from it. Since focusing on exporting and importing, they now have one of the highest GDP per capita in the world. So as this slide says, they really went from zero to hero. They completely changed it around. The capital of Singapore is Singapore, which I thought was a little weird when doing my research. I actually had to look up a few sources because I was so confused. But if you recall one of those first slides, I did a map of Singapore and its islands. So Singapore is actually just the biggest island there and the main region. And that's why they call it the Republic of Singapore, because there's those outlying islands as well. For the geographical landmarks, the two I picked were the Kranji Marshes and the Klang River. So for the marshes, it is their largest freshwater farmland within Singapore. Two facts I thought were really interesting was there's 54 different types of butterflies and 170 species of birds within this marshland there. And then for the Klang River, it is the longest river in Singapore, and it's actually named after some of the original indigenous people that had traveled down to Singapore. They were pretty skilled boatsmen and ended up deciding to stay within the region. For my two historical landmarks, the first of the two I picked Merlion Park. It's based on a mythical creature. It was built in 1964, and it's considered an emblem of Singapore. Forgive me if I'm getting this part slightly wrong, but Singapore is actually a second or third derived word, and I believe it means the Lion City. So that kind of plays a role in this Merlion Park here. The second of the two, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but it's called Chimes. So Chimes was originally a Catholic girls' school as well as an orphanage. Babies were even abandoned on the steps of this orphanage way back in the day. It's the second oldest building within all of Singapore, and Now it's a famous restaurant. They decided to keep the building because of its rich history within the country, and as I said, it's a restaurant now. So the cultural highlight is something pretty simple, but something I really liked. So Singaporeans are pretty renowned for how kind they are, and I found out why while doing my studies. It's actually something that they teach. So there is a national campaign that teaches manners and kindness, and it's really big within the culture for Singapore to have this. So the government has this program that really instills into their citizens that they want kindness there. As you can see here, it was originally called the National Courtesy Campaign, which ran from 1970 all the way till 2001, and at which point it rebranded itself into the Singapore Kindness Movement, which is still ongoing and it's still very active within their community. Now, for the politics of Singapore, it is a little different. So, they have a parliamentary democratic republic, and within this, they do have the typical three branches of the government. They have their legislation branch, their executive branch, and their judiciary branch. They have their president, which is actually in the legislative branch. Above that, they have their executive branch, which will consist of the prime minister as well as parliament. And then, as I said before, they also have their judiciary branch as well. For their economy, it is a free market economy. The World Economic Forum has rated it as the most open economy for trade. It's rated the third least corrupt, and it's also rated the most pro-business. And I think that earlier slide talking about Singapore going from zero to hero, as I had put it, really resonates with some of these rankings right here. It really shows that they really focused on their economy and how they do trade, and it's really instilled there. Some of their exports include electronics, chemicals, and services. Now for their GDP, their total GDP is 372.1 billion, and the per capita GDP value is $65,233.28. This slide I think is pretty interesting. So the natural resources, they have arable land, which is just considered farmable land. Fish, because like I said, they are an island, so there's lots of salt water there. But the thing to really consider is Singapore has very minimal natural resources, which, as I make note here, makes their economic journey even greater because they didn't have anything incredibly valuable that would typically make a country rich, right? They really had to base it off of how they do their trade and their economy. For the cost of living, the first thing I'd like to note on this slide is depending on which region you live within Singapore, it does vary a lot. There are really cheaper areas in compared to the US, but I wanted to focus a little locally, and if you're looking at central Singapore there, it's really comparable to the Seattle area. Transportation, it's similar. The rent, it's only a few dollars off. So when you compare it to something locally that we can tangibly grasp, it's very similar to living in Seattle. The national dish is called Hainanese chicken rice, which is just a seasoned chicken, some rice, and then typically with sauces to season to taste. As for the holiday, I did have a hard time finding what the most important holiday was, only because when looking into Singapore, they're an extremely diverse country. There's lots of different cultural backgrounds. So, some were saying Chinese New Year, just the regular New Year, etc. So it was a little hard to determine, but I kind of decided to settle on their National Day, which is just like their Independence Day. This occurs on August 9th every year. It's celebrating their fairly recent independence as a country. Some of the fun includes fireworks, one of the biggest parades of the entire year, as well as a speech from their prime minister. As for current news, Singapore is actually set to reopen to specific countries, and this is supposed to occur on August 26th, I believe. At the time of recording, that's just a little over a week and a half away. And this announcement on the news article I'm looking at was within a day or two old, so relatively quick how fast they're doing this. The countries they're allowing in are Germany, Hong Kong, Brunei, and Macau. Um, they will not require any quarantine for these visitors. One thing to note is Singapore has one of the highest vaccination rates in the entire world. They've done a really good job at locking down their country, keeping their citizens safe, and their death toll numbers are among the smallest, if not the smallest. For this slide, I kind of wanted to retouch on something that I've made a comment on a few times. So, what's so fascinating for me with this country, and that's kind of the history of their economy. So, for a country that came into independence within the last 60 years, and they started from a really poverty background where they were facing lots of unemployment, lots of people without homes, and this country has no natural resources that would be considered a gold mine for lack of better terms. And they were really able to focus in on what other countries had done well, come together as a government, and just focus on their importing and exporting. And I thought reading into that was the most amazing part about this entire journey of learning about Singapore. So, if there's one thing I really thought was fascinating, it would just be retouching on something that, like I said, I've talked about several times over now. I want to thank all of you who have made it this far. I really appreciate you listening, and I hope you were able to learn a couple things.